Welcome to Mental Health is Community Health. My name is Denise Signo and I'm with Howard Center. So glad to see you here. For those of you who aren't familiar with us, we're a mission-driven organization and we provide mental health, substance use, and developmental services. This is our first in-person session since 2019 and we're just delighted to be back here at Yale.com. They're so gracious and welcoming and they open up their workplace to our community. So thank you, Yale.com. To make our program more accessible, we are live streaming tonight, and you'll see the Media Factory folks all around the room, and they're actually out in the back too. So thank you very, very much, Media Factory. We do want to apologize that we fully intended to have ASL interpretation support here tonight, but there is apparently a really chronic shortage and we haven't been able to engage anyone. So hopefully we will be able to for our May 2nd event. Tonight's format, after Dr. Ravven's talk, we're going to open up the floor both here and for our live stream audience through chat for Q&A, and you'll come down to this mic here right behind Dr. Ravven. We do ask that everyone use the mic just because it will make it much, people will be able to hear here in the room and also on the live stream. We will end at 8 p.m. And I want to turn to just say thank you very much to our sponsors. We are really fortunate to have the support of all of these wonderful folks on the screen, and they're off again, so we'll just let them be. Blue Cross Blue Shield of Vermont, Hickok and Boardman Insurance Group, the Stotts Brocious Group at Morgan Stanley, University of Vermont Medical Center, and Velco, Vermont Electric Power Company. So thank you all very much. So a few housekeeping announcements. Our arrangement with Dealer.com is that we use the usher system to bring people into the theater and to also help people get back out to the front. So if you need to leave early or even if you need to use the restroom, we will usher you around. And then after the talk, we'd appreciate your feedback. We have feedback forms in your folder, and then our live stream, we will be sending a link immediately following. Now, let's turn to our talk. It's my privilege to introduce my colleague and Howard Center's Chief Medical Officer, Dr. Simha Ravven. Dr. Ravven is an assistant clinical professor in law and psychiatry at the Yale University School of Medicine, an assistant clinical professor of psychiatry at the University of Vermont, and past president of the Vermont Medical Society. She graduated from U of Iowa Carver College of Medicine and completed her residency in psychiatry at Harvard Medical School. She went on to train in forensic psychiatry at Yale University School of Medicine, where you continue to serve on the faculty. You're board certified in general adult and forensic psychiatry, and her passion is in caring for adults with serious mental illness and contributing to some of what we're going to talk about tonight, research and policy on the intersection of law and mental health. Dr. Ravven has received numerous professional honors. She's written extensively and presented extensively. She is you are a wonderful and approachable colleague and well known for your kindness, your compassion, and your expertise. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Simha Ravven.
Thank you so much, Denise, for that wonderful introduction. I'm really excited to be here and to be kicking off the community education series. I love the reminder that this is the first in-person one since 2019, and I feel especially lucky and honored to be talking to you today. So I'll go ahead and get started. I have to live up to that wonderful introduction, and thank you.
Can you move the mic a little closer or just...
Sure. Are you having trouble hearing me?
Yeah, I'm not hearing any amplification.
Okay. Is that better?
A little bit. We can turn it up.
Do I turn it up over here?
Yeah.
How is that? Can everybody hear me? Wonderful. All good? Okay, very good. Very good. So mental health is community health. So I developed the title of this before I really developed the talk. So I will be talking about law and mental health in Vermont, But as I really thought about what was important to us, it wasn't so much a dry talk on Vermont mental health law, though that is important, and I promise I will go over some highlights of that. But what was really relevant, and I think really matters to the work that many of us do and the challenges that we see in our community, is the context in which we apply mental health law in Vermont. So I'm going to be talking more about, can you hear me out there? Okay, very good. About the human end of this, and I'll be talking about I'll get to it, and I'll tell you a little more as we go along. So Denise did a wonderful introduction. I'm Dr. Simha Ravven. I'm Chief Medical Officer at Howard Center, and as she mentioned, I wear a number of different professional hats. I serve on faculty at the Division of Law and Psychiatry at Yale School of Medicine, and I've done that. Time goes very quickly. I've done that for 10 years now, and I serve on faculty at the University of Vermont Larner College of Medicine, and I'm a past president of the Vermont Medical Society. So this is what we'll be talking about today. I'll discuss a case, the story of an individual who experiences homelessness and serious mental illness. I'll give a little bit of the history in the United States of developments in mental health care and some scientific and legislative changes that have brought us to where we are. And then I will review Vermont mental health law and give some highlights on voluntary and involuntary psychiatric treatment and mandated community treatment. So I find that I learn best from narratives, and I'm going to actually share the story of a real person here. Sitting on the bed, that's a young man, and his name is Andrei Shevelev. If this looks familiar, it may be because you read the New York Times, and this was a feature in the Times a few weeks ago talking about this young man and his experiences, and I'll detail that as we go along. As I was thinking about what to talk about here tonight and how to illustrate some of the issues that we're dealing with as a community, I initially wanted to talk about individuals who are local, who live in Vermont and in Burlington, whom I know and have similar stories. But as you can imagine, it was really hard to do that and keep their privacy protected. So I'm going to share the story of Andrei, whose story is in the public domain and was recently, featured in the New York Times. And so this is Andrei sitting cross-legged on the bed, and that's his mother, Olga. As we go along, I'm going to encourage you to think about the sometimes competing concerns of individual autonomy and individual living and treatment preferences, and the sometimes competing concerns of community and individual safety. So to keep those themes in mind as we go along. So Andrei is 31 years old. He experiences schizoaffective disorder and has hallucinations and delusions, and sometimes experiences mood disturbances. His family doesn't live in Vermont. They live in the Pacific Northwest. And up until his mid-20s, from what Andrei and his parents described, he could blend in with other kids. In high school, he was bright with a tight-knit group of friends who were all avid gamers like himself. And after he graduated, his parents hoped that he would go on to college for art or music, his interests. Both his parents worked as stagehands and had good union jobs, and Andrei seemed eager to do the same. But Andrei started to experience symptoms of a psychotic disorder. His roommates kicked him out, and he then moved to the couch in Sam and Olga, his stepfather and mother's one-bedroom apartment in Vancouver. And he struggled at work. At work, there were incidents, and he had what others saw as odd and threatening behavior that was upsetting to his coworkers. Sam and Olga became worried about him, and they made an appointment for him to see a therapist. He said to the therapist, "I feel like I'm driving my friends away." This was when he was 26, so some years later. "I used to be able to talk to people. Now they're not interested." He told the therapist about a family tragedy, a source of pain that he'd really tried not to think about for years. When he was 8, he watched his twin sister, Sasha, drown in a duck pond in a neighbor's yard. The children were alone. He had tried to save her. And he said, "I've thought about it to exhaustion. I've incorporated her into these stories I make up." His mother, Olga, agonized over his future, but felt unsafe having him live with her. And then 3 years ago, when he stopped taking antipsychotic medication, Andre became more troubled and withdrew into the delusional thoughts that were troubling him, and had more what his parents described as unpredictable and frightening behavior. His parents were concerned that they might get evicted from their apartment, and Olga and her husband Sam sought a no-contact order to keep Andre away. So since then, he had lived in a tent, and we're in the Pacific Northwest, and near Vancouver, and he was seen wearing threadbare clothes and carrying a machete for protection. Twice he'd been in jail, and voiced concerns, worried concerns about the CIA. 3 times he'd been involuntarily psychiatrically hospitalized, and subject to physical restraints and forced involuntary medication. So this picture here was at a more hopeful moment. Now Olga and Andre are together at room 117 in a budget hotel overlooking the interstate, and the county had allotted a significant amount of funds, $8,400, to house him temporarily as part of an effort by the state to divert people who experienced serious mental illness away from the criminal justice system. And this was enough money to keep him at this hotel for 8 weeks. So these are really similar issues that are challenging communities around the country and around. Affordable housing can be really difficult to access. Some people who experience serious mental illness may be reluctant to be housed or really have negative experiences in subsidized housing. Disruptive neighbors, crime and substance use in housing can also make it unappealing or unsafe. And as many of us have experienced, or many of us know, people who experience serious mental illness are often disproportionately shunted to the criminal justice system for what are often described as nuisance crimes, like public urination or disturbing the peace. So back to Andre. We know that he's now temporarily housed. This picture shows where he was camping. And in this precious window of time, his mother would like to try to convince him to accept treatment and accept housing. "What's next?" she asked him. She had offered him clothes, a hot meal, books to read, but he didn't want those things. All he wanted was to sleep on her couch for a little while. "I won't get in the way," he said. This was the problem, she told him. He scared people. At one point, Convinced that she and Sam, his stepfather, were body doubles remote controlled by the CIA, he smashed the rear window of their car with a flagpole and they had called 911. She said carefully to him, "You sort of have an idea that your behavior was inappropriate." She told him carefully, and then she gulped and said, "Some medications do help. You have that condition, that medical condition that has to be addressed." But Andre knew this was coming, and he had an answer. He did not accept diagnosis of schizoaffective disorder and did not feel that his thoughts were delusional, and felt strongly that if it were a choice between taking medication and living outside, he would choose to live outside. Still, he wanted to be near Olga, near his mom, and he looked for a compromise. "There are a lot of forested areas outside where we live," he said. "I could set up a tent." "Set up a tent," Olga repeated dully. She was standing by the ironing board, and she began to cry. So before the money ran out, Andre had a choice to make, or had to make a choice both. Would he accept that he needed treatment and have housing that was contingent upon that, as his parents hoped he would, and move into a group home? Would he go back to living in a tent, or was there another way, another option for him? I'm going to take a step back here and say, how did we get to this place? And how did we get to a place where many people who experience serious mental illness have these kinds of challenges with housing and basic support like Andre? I'm going to go back actually quite a ways and show a brief video about the beginning of the asylum movement in the mid-19th century. Just a word of warning, the brief film I show uses language that was acceptable at that time that we might feel, find really antiquated or offensive. So a note before we get to that. Very good. So the first psychiatric hospital was actually established in 1773, but asylums were few and far between until the mid-1800s. And this brief film strip told the story of Dorothea Dix, who advocated for these asylums and these kinds of hospitals. And I'll talk a little bit about that in Vermont and what has happened since then. Oh, we don't want to play it again. I just want to advance the slide. Okay. No? Ah, I can just, there we are. Did that work? There we are. Dorothea Dix started lobbying states to create asylums and eventually helped establish or expand more than 30 institutions. Many more were created in the decades that followed. And I found this figure astonishing. By the height of institutionalization in the mid-50s, roughly 500,000 people were living in state-run psychiatric facilities. And this slide shows the Dorothea Dix Hospital in New Jersey. And the Vermont Asylum for the Insane was founded in 1834. That is now known as the Brattleboro Retreat. And that's actually the first facility for the care of people who experience mental illness founded in Vermont, and one of the first 10 private psychiatric hospitals in the US. This is an historic picture of the Brattleboro Retreat, and the initial intent and design was to be a safe therapeutic place where people who experience mental illness could live quality and productive lives. And sometimes they succeeded in doing this. Some self-sufficient asylum communities provided employment and sustenance for residents, small-scale agricultural production, laundries, and bakeries. But as more people were moved into the institutions, they quickly outgrew their capacity, and staff struggled to keep up with patients' needs. I think it's worthwhile to note, too, that what was categorized at that time as mental illness is very different than what we sort of define in that way today. So when a public psychiatric hospital in Worcester, Massachusetts opened in 1833, for example, it had room for 120 people, and just 13 years later, it had almost 400 people living there. The problem grew significantly worse during World War II, when many doctors and other staff were drafted, leaving hospitals really dangerously understaffed. So from well-intentioned and bucolic beginnings to very tenuous and dangerous and crowded situations. I'm going to share one more slide of those bucolic intent. This is from the Brattleboro Retreat. This is the Retreat Farm. This is now a separate nonprofit organization, but it was built as a working farm to support the patients and staff at the Brattleboro Retreat. And it's this is the contemporary organization, but you can see the dairy farm and creamery that once supported the hospital and its community. It was essentially like a self-contained village. This may look familiar to some of you. This is the Vermont State Hospital in Waterbury, and that was built in 1890 to alleviate overcrowding at the Vermont Asylum or the Brattleboro Retreat. And then the retreat's name was changed to distinguish it from the Vermont State Hospital because they were so similar in name. And the resulting conditions of the overcrowding that I described look remarkably similar to those seen in contemporary jails and prisons. This is an historical picture, I think mid-20th century, of a hospital. And I'll point out that I think for privacy, people's faces are whited out for privacy. And this was, arguably the beginning of the end for the state hospital system, but factors other than overcrowding sort of sped that up. That's a contemporary prison, and you can see the parallels there. That's another image of a hospital, a mid-20th century hospital, and another image of a contemporary prison. I'm going to show a section of this documentary. This is a PBS documentary that gives a really good overview of major scientific, legislative, and social contributors to mental health care in the last century. And I'm just going to show an excerpt of that. Oh.
A new revolution would help end the lobotomy craze.
So they're talking here about the production and development of Thorazine, the first antipsychotic medication.
And one of the most hopeful contributions of that research is new drugs.
It says over here you heard voices. Is that true?
Yes.
All of the drugs in psychiatry were discovered serendipitously by accidental, clever clinical observation.
This is me when I came to the hospital. I was very upset from many worries.
What did the voices say to you, Sally?
Trágate, Sally. Coge, Sally. Estúpida.
Thorazine, the first antipsychotic, was discovered because it was being used by surgeons as an antiemetic so people wouldn't throw up during operations. And it calmed the patients down.
This is me after the doctor gave me some medicine to help me.
And you were telling me there was something wrong in the neighborhood, is that right?
Now I'm not so mixed up. I talked to him okay.
Well, you said you
There's no question that in the scope of history, when it comes to understanding mental illness, the real turning point came with the introduction of Thorazine.
The effects of these drugs on Sally and patients like her led scientists to a new theory: that antipsychotics alter levels of a chemical in the brain called dopamine. Dopamine was one of dozens of neurotransmitters discovered over time.
In identifying these, seeing what parts of the brain those were operative in, we developed drugs and used them to treat various types of neuropsychiatric conditions.
To this day, how exactly changes in brain chemistry lead to changes in thought and behavior remains unknown. But in the 1950s, antipsychotics let asylums do the unthinkable: send patients home.
What's the difference?
I feel like I talk just to myself. I don't feel like talking to nobody else, just to myself.
Patients who were hitherto unmanageable or untreatable, or who had resisted all other forms of treatment, now have been helped.
I am very happy to go home.
When Thorazine first came onto the market, it was advertised as a chemical lobotomy. But the idea that patients who may not have had much hope before could take a pill and be discharged from a hospital was quite miraculous.
Antipsychotics had serious side effects, but almost immediately reduced the need for mass institutionalization, just as it reached its height.
The height of the asylum population was about 1955. And at that point, I think 550,000 people were hospitalized. This was a major part of the fabric of society. You probably knew multiple people who had been hospitalized.
the advent of pharmaceuticals fueled deinstitutionalization. But as patients left the asylum, they also left the institutional safety net Dix's moral treatment had provided.
One of the things that we often overlook is how much agency patients themselves had about their lives in creating the world in which they lived. They formed relationships. They wrote institutional newspapers. They found forms of self-expression in an otherwise impoverished and brutal environment.
But suddenly now, there is new hope for all. For you, the public, who pay the bills, and for us, the mentally sick.
People with serious mental illness who are leaving psychiatric hospitals said to themselves, we need a place to go. No one really wants us. No one will employ us. Where can we go that's safe and actually rebuild our lives in some fashion, to whatever degree we can do that?
Patients and advocates worked to build a patchwork system of locally based community care. Some leaders paid attention and looked for alternatives to institutionalization.
You, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, do solemnly swear.
I, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, do solemnly swear.
When John F. Kennedy became president in 1961, he'd only recently learned about the disastrous outcome of his sister Rosemary's lobotomy.
Kennedy himself had a strong, I guess, guilt and desire to improve the life of the mentally ill in the country.
So help me God.
Like Dorothea Dix more than a century before, he called for America to treat the mentally ill with greater compassion.
The mentally ill and the mentally retarded need no longer be alien to our affections or beyond the help of our communities. Under this legislation, custodial mental institutions will be replaced by therapeutic centers.
Congress passed the Community Mental Health Act of 1963 to fund the alternative programs patients and advocates had initiated. This was Kennedy's last legislative victory. He was assassinated 3 weeks later.
I think that in years to come, that those who've been engaged in this enterprise can feel the greatest source of pride and satisfaction, and that they will recognize that there were not many things that they did during their time in office which had more lasting imprint on the well-being and happiness of more people. So I express all of our thanks to them, and I think it's a good job, well done.
In that speech, JFK saw a vision of the future where 50% of the population would no longer need to be hospitalized.
The promise was great. It was an era of democratization. The patients were very much involved. We were not only going to be changing the world for the severely ill who were discharged, but we also had high hopes that we could help improve the whole mental health of the communities.
Then, in 1965, President Johnson signed Medicaid into law to cover medical costs for low-income Americans. But psychiatric hospitals with more than 16 beds were not covered. One goal was to steer money into community care and away from asylums. These castles, optimistically built to cure the mentally ill, hadn't fulfilled their promise, and opposition to them reached a crescendo.
When were you admitted to the hospital?
It was about 5 weeks ago.
And who actually brought you to the hospital?
My husband and 6 policemen and 3 police cars.
It began to be expressed that any form of involuntary hospital commitment was a crime of the state against individual liberty.
And then came the Hollywood movie, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest.
Did Billy Bibbett leave the grounds of the hospital, gentlemen?
Which really portrayed psychiatry in an extremely negative light.
I want an answer to my question.
As fools or villains or both.
The film captivated America in 1975. the same year the Supreme Court ruled the mentally ill could not be forcibly committed unless they posed a danger to self or other.
There is no constitutional basis for confining such persons involuntarily if they are dangerous to no one and can live safely in freedom.
This landmark victory allowed patients to refuse care, but in many ways backfired.
The deinstitutionalization movement was driven by a true and beneficent, progressive ideal for providing a better chance at life and health for people who had been locked away. To the extent that many of those people were freed and have gone on to live full and complete lives, right? Those were really progressive developments. But this is difficult because to refuse care also puts the onus on you to care for yourself. And society has to figure out a way to deal with that.
The 1970s brought new freedom for patients, but also a financial crisis that drove a conservative backlash against social programs.
The history of American mental health care is a history of liberal, expansive projects to provide progressive care and recoiling against the costs and the nature of the social commitment.
This dream of being treated in the community never came to fruition because the money did not follow the patients.
You've got the federal government basically saying, we're going to close down a system that is pernicious and punitive and inhumane, but we're not going to make enough of a durable investment into communities.
We'll continue to search for ways to cut the size of government and reduce the amount of federal spending.
The Community Mental Health Act hits the rocks with the Reagan-era conservative revolution, which argues that, government isn't the solution to your problem. Government is the problem.
He took the money that had been allocated specifically for the mental patients in the community and instead gave them to the states as a block grant, which the state could use for the mentally ill or use to reduce taxes or increase other programs and eventually to build prisons.
All right, we're gonna stop there, and we'll leave us there, and that kind of brings us up to some of the struggles that we are having now with supporting community programming with far less resources than was initially envisioned. I'm going to fix my slides so that we go back to the slides rather than the video. So hold on just a moment. There we are. And I'm going to actually highlight here some of the good work that many of my colleagues that I see in the audience and very talented colleagues do, and highlight some of the things that, some of the places where Howard Center and our community partners come in. So as I was thinking about Andre and some of the programs and supports that would assist him and other individuals in similar situations. I want to highlight some of our programs, particularly in adult mental health. So I'll elaborate on this in a little bit. But as I was thinking about Andre and also thinking about the trajectory in mental health care in the United States that you just saw in the PBS documentary, it brought to mind the programs that we have in crisis, community support, counseling, employment support, and housing support that might support someone like Andre. I'm also going to highlight a few things that we already saw in the PBS film. So this is an image of President John F. Kennedy signing the Mental Retardation Facilities and Community Health Centers Construction Act. And as you heard, it turned out to actually be the last bill that he would sign. And under the 1963 law, he said custodial mental institutions would be replaced by community mental health centers, thus allowing patients to live and get psychiatric care in their communities. And as you saw, because of multiple factors, including Reagan-era shifts and priorities, far fewer of these resources were put toward community treatment than initially intended. And this is really, we are still living in the shadow of these decisions and contributed to the shortage of mental health care that we still experience in our community and many other communities. I'm also going to highlight here the O'Connor v. Donaldson decision. This is the landmark decision of the United States Supreme Court. It's a ruling that states that a state cannot constitutionally confine a non-dangerous individual who's capable of surviving safely in freedom and caring for themselves, including caring for themselves with the help of family and friends. And this is really very broad language that has been interpreted in multiple different ways. And I wanted to quote actually briefly directly from that decision. The decision asks, may the state fence in the harmless mentally ill solely to save its citizens from exposure to those whose ways are different? And this is a bit of a summarization. Can the state hospitalize someone so they live more comfortably than they would in the community? And the decision answered this question. The answer is no, they cannot. So what we've really seen is a shift to the community without robust resources. Deinstitutionalization shifted the burden from the person to prove sanity, O'Connor v. Donaldson, to the state to prove dangerousness. But the shift didn't guarantee care, treatment, housing, work, acceptance, or community. And the result was arguably a trans-institutional shift to the prisons through the police and the courts. So this is a visual of that shift, and this visual shows the years 1963 to 2003, and I'm just going to highlight some things here. You can see that on the left-hand column, the black bar represents the number of people who experience serious mental illness living in psychiatric hospitals. And you can see on the right, which is 2003, the number of people who were residing in hospitals shrank dramatically. You can also see the maroon bar is people who were unhoused. And you can see how that grew enormously in those 40 years. And I'll also highlight the red bar. That's the number of people who were incarcerated. And I'll just highlight here that one of the factors here was people going from hospital to prison, but it's not the only factor that we're seeing here. Another contributor was the sort of the broken windows theory of policing that was that grew in the 1980s, which was the idea that in order to prevent larger crimes, police needed to crack down on low-level quality of life crimes. And that actually disproportionately affected people who experienced mental illness. So, for instance, a person acting erratically could be charged with disorderly conduct, or someone without access to a bathroom could be charged for public urination. So you saw people entering the prison system for essentially nuisance crimes who wouldn't have been incarcerated prior. And I just wanted to point out that the tough on crime rhetoric also helped enforce the persistent assumption that I think is still out there, that people who experience mental illness are dangerous and need to be kept off the streets to protect the rest of us. I think this is probably familiar to many of us, but I think it still is worth noting that people who experience mental illness are far likelier to be victims of violence than perpetrators of violence. So it's important to note that, and I think that we are successful in moving away from this dynamic in our community, but we've also seen that often when police are first responders, that people who experience mental illness can end up in the criminal justice system and in the court system and incarcerated. In terms of our local services, Howard Center services such as First Call for Chittenden County, community outreach, street outreach, and the now under development mental health urgent care program address these issues of making sure that people who need mental health supports do not end up in the criminal justice system and are appropriately supported with mental health care and supports. This is another visual that tells more or less the same story, but a little differently. So the solid black line represents the number of US adults who, per 100,000, who reside in an institution, meaning prison or psychiatric hospital. And it is very tiny numbers, so I'll just highlight that this starts in 1928 and ends in the year 2000. And you can see that the red dotted line represents people in psychiatric hospitals, or it says the mental hospital rate, and the black dotted line, the prison rate. And you can see the drop in the mental hospital rate and the inverse growth in the prison rate. And I've highlighted how that is multifactorial, but this is a really striking image that shows essentially transinstitutionalization from hospitals to prisons. So I'm going to take the opportunity to highlight some specific programs at Howard Center that support individuals and support self-determination and individual treatment choice. These programs also support people to stay in the community and out of hospitals and corrections. This is the same slide you saw earlier. This is not by any means an exhaustive list of Howard Center programs, but highlights some of the adult mental health programs. I wanted to highlight the Community Support Program, which serves Chittenden County adults 18 and older who experience severe and persistent mental health challenges. In order to participate in this program, people need to meet specific eligibility requirements set by the state of Vermont. And this program helps people to recover and lead fulfilling lives. Most of my clinical work is within this program. Community Support Program supports people with case management, counseling, employment services, housing assistance and residential services, social and recreational opportunities, and psychiatric care. I wanted to highlight the ASSIST program, which is a crisis residential program. You see my awkward red arrows in the back because that's ASSIST in the back. That's actually next door in the front, but this was a better picture than I could find. So those awkward red arrows are actually pointing to ASSIST. And this is for adults who are experiencing a psychiatric crisis, people who are either either avoid hospital care because they don't need that level of care, stepping down from hospital care. I also wanted to highlight the START program, Stabilization, Treatment, and Recovery Team, which is a community peer support team with peer community recovery specialists. And First Call for Chittenden County, serving people in the community, regardless of age and diagnosis, through multiple different means, and providing crisis intervention, assessments, and referral to other kinds of care through those assessments. And often collaborating with emergency responders as needed. And I'll give a reminder here that this does not take the place of emergency medical care or assessment. And in a medical emergency, it's appropriate to call 911, just to give a delineation there. And I'm going to move us back to Andre now that we have a background on on the history and have a sense of how Andre got to where he is in a much broader sense. So initially, Andre's parents hoped that a new Washington state involuntary treatment law would help him with a number of supports, help him get daily group therapy, housing, and safety, medication, but they were really disappointed to find that that law was not yet in place. So they pinned their hopes on a program focused on providing housing first. And if Andre got permanent housing with no strings attached, they hoped that outreach workers could build a rapport and gradually broach the subject of medication with him. And this approach, known as Housing First, has emerged as a primary strategy for addressing homelessness in many American cities and actually across the globe. And the strength is to allow cities and municipalities to address things like tent encampments without encroaching on individuals' civil liberties. And that was the path that was open to Andre. So Andre is now, he's at his hotel in Washington state, and the front desk calls him to say his caseworker has come to visit and she has excellent news. The local housing authority has offered him a one-bedroom at Central Park Place, which is a low-income apartment building, which is on the grounds of the Vancouver Veterans Affairs Hospital. And the residents there are primarily veterans, but there are rooms set aside for people like Andre who experience mental illness, and the fee for rent is something that he can cover with his disability check, $590 a month. So that placement solves several problems at once. He would no longer be at risk of freezing to death. He's at much lower risk of ending up in the court system or of frightening people around him and in his community. It was also a triumph for the caseworkers working with him. And for Andre, it meant that the pressure was off. He had a safe place to live that wasn't contingent on engaging in treatment and medications that he did not want. So he signed forms saying that he wouldn't punch walls, start fires, or smoke in the unit. And beside other residents who were men in their 60s and 70s primarily, he seemed vigorous and charismatic. And his apartment was tiny but pristine with a window overlooking the roadway. So things were looking up for Andre, and he was housed on terms that he could agree with and felt good about. So this is an image of Olga, Andre's mother, with Andre and his twin, Sasha, before they left Russia for the United States. And Andre had been in his apartment for almost a month when the building manager spoke to Sam and Olga. Andre was screaming during quiet hours. Some of the other men were afraid of him. When the manager knocked on the door, he didn't answer. He was losing weight and experiencing symptoms of psychosis. He was avoiding food and had fears it was poisoned. And actually, his future was unclear, and that's where we leave Andre. His future is unclear. So this sort of begs the question, when can the state of Vermont impose mental health treatment? Because if you imagine that Andre were in Vermont, his parents would probably be asking that question, and actually were asking that question. And I'll give a brief overview of involuntary hospitalization, involuntary medication, and mandated treatment in the community. And I'll just highlight here in Vermont, the answer to the questions, when are some of the circumstances in which an individual can be compelled to treatment? The brief answer is very, very narrow circumstances, and generally, though not always, for a very short period of time. So this is my very brief summary of criteria for involuntary psychiatric admission. A person who has a mental illness, and as a result of that mental illness, this is more of the practical application, poses a danger of harm to themselves or others. And I'll add, and I brought some of the language of the law in a broader summary here, and I'll add also cannot meet their basic needs. I'm going to leave this up here and let you look at this briefly because it's actually quite wordy, and I thought that I would just let you read that for a moment. This defines what danger of harm to self or others or inability to care for oneself is. So in practice, it is very hard to be hospitalized. It's very difficult to meet the criteria to be hospitalized involuntarily, and it is also very rigorously reassessed because Vermont takes very seriously depriving somebody of their liberty. And likewise, the criteria for involuntary medication is also very narrow. Under very narrow circumstances, in the course of an involuntary hospitalization, someone can have court-ordered medication. The process is really lengthy, and people often wait a really long time, many weeks, before they receive medication. It's also, well, it can also feel somewhat arbitrary. It's actually, while the hospital petitions the court for involuntary medication, it's actually the judge that determines which medications and at what doses. Asterisk here, if you would like to view the statute, I'm very happy to send it to you. We also have mandated community treatment in Vermont, and this is called an order of non-hospitalization. I can tell you that I put this on a slide. I tried many ways to describe it, and I thought, my goodness, I'm going to admit something here. I was in Vermont for many years working in mental health care before I really understood what an order of non-hospitalization was. I had a kind colleague who worked at a designated agency before I did, and she probably explained it to me 7 or 8 times. So I am more than happy to share the official language, but I'm going to give my summary of what the effect is, though you may be able to grasp this far quicker than I did. Many states have some form of mandated community treatment, and this mandates adherence to mental health care, medications, housing, when it's relevant, substance use testing. I say theoretically because our version of mandated community treatment in Vermont is not easy to enforce and is largely unenforced. An order of non-hospitalization can be issued either by family court or by the criminal courts. And theoretically, a non-adherent individual, meaning someone who is under an order of non-hospitalization and doesn't do the things that they're supposed to do under that order, can be sent back to the hospital more rapidly and under different circumstances than if they were not under that order of non-hospitalization. I think it's fair to say that they're really not enforced and meaningful only in very narrow circumstances. The circumstances under which I've seen them be meaningful is if an individual internalizes that order and says, okay, I'm supposed to do this thing, and that will change what I do because it's meaningful to me. And that's pretty narrow. So what are the meaningful ways to reach people with support? And that's largely with voluntary support. And sometimes it's practical support, seeing what people's needs and goals are, and thinking about Andre. Someday that's very practical support, food and housing, and seeing what an individual's goals are and how we can help support them in their own goals and immediate or long-term needs. You've seen this slide several times by now. And I'm thinking also about Andre and how he, when he likely leaves his housing, may traverse his community, and what some of the things that might be helpful for him are. I think I've talked a bit about our street and community outreach programs. Some of these folks are here, and I just wanted to put a face to the names and a shout out to my very talented colleagues. And something we've not touched on too much, but is really important, is social connection and community. And I'll highlight here Westview House, which is a day program for adults who have been diagnosed with a major mental illness. It provides lunch, and clients often volunteer there, and the people I work with often talk about what a important work that is for them. And Career Connections, which supports individuals in the community support program with career counseling, job development, post-employment support, and education and training. So I will stop there. I want to thank everyone for your attention, and really I just open up the floor for questions.
Thank you, Cindy. So we do need to have folks use the mic, so if anyone has any questions, if you can just come up here, that would be great. Bridget, if anyone has questions in the chat, you can step up too.
Thank you, Simi, for that great presentation. I do have one person, Jackie, a former START peer support worker, has a question in the chat. Jackie writes, I've recently heard more voices being raised that Vermont needs a larger state hospital again because it's better than being homeless with a mental illness. That is sad and scary. How do you answer that?
So I would answer that by saying if Vermont needs more state hospital beds and more room and room for more people for treatment at the state hospital, it's not as a solution to housing insecurity and homelessness. As we've talked about. There are many other solutions to be for community housing, but for sure I would oppose that assertion.
Thank you. And then I guess building on that question, I was wondering, I know I did read the New York Times article about Andre, and I saw it mention that other states are expanding their involuntary treatment laws. Could you talk a bit about what other states are doing, and then more broadly, like what are the trends looking like in Vermont?
Yeah, so the New York Times article highlighted, and I chose not to highlight this here because there's only so much room, that some other states are going in the direction of expanding involuntary treatment. I don't think that's the direction that we're going in. And as we can see, there are not simple answers here. And that involuntary treatment comes with a lot of problems. I think one of our strengths in Vermont is that we take people's individual autonomy and choice and liberty really seriously.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Any others on the, oh, come on up.
Hello, I'm a social worker at the Community Health Center, so FQHC, and wondering about access to the services. So I know Assist cut their beds, and it's hard to get into CRT. And if you are, how can we increase access and delivery of services?
That is an awesome question, and I think we can increase access to services by letting our lawmakers know that we need resources for these services, and to expand resources for organization providing services that, like you've described. So we're limited in what we can provide by the amount of resources and funding that we have. And just a note, you will probably be pleased to hear that Assist expanded the beds to 6, so you may have an easier time, and I imagine you will, accessing those specific resources.
So no longer combined with addiction?
That's right.
Hello, hello. Cool. Thanks for that great talk. The history of it and the videos was great and really helpful. It left me with a question of what's your number one go-to kind of institutional solution to the problem? Because what I got from that history is there was like the high point in about the 50s, let's say, and now it's gone to prison and community solutions. Is there a institutional solution at this point, or is it pretty much, I don't know, not one to speak of?
Tell me, if I could ask you to elaborate a little bit more on what you mean by an institutional solution?
Yeah, I guess something like the mental hospitals, something like the asylums in 55, though we wouldn't call them that now. And maybe there's something new.
You know, I wish I could summarize one solution to these complex challenges. I really can't, and I thought a lot about that. Like if I had to suggest one solution to this, but I really highlighted this to illustrate some of the complexities that we're dealing with, and I wish I could say that I had one solution that I think would be effective and adequately address individual choice and community safety, and I don't.
Yeah.
It's an excellent question. I think if you had the answer, it's $1 million answer.
Hi, thanks. So in all of the things you mentioned that we do at Howard Center, you didn't mention our collaborative network approach, and I'm wondering what your thoughts are around collaborative network approach, and just maybe if you could highlight that for folks to know that that is an alternative that's pretty positive.
Thank you so much. And maybe I could call on you to talk a little bit about collaborative network approach and highlight that. I really appreciate you bringing that up.
So I'm not going to talk about it, but we do have an expert at Howard Center that can talk about that. I'm wondering if Leslie Nelson, would you mind? I'm sorry to put you on the spot, Leslie. Sort of.
Thank you, Leslie.
I promise I won't hold everybody hostage because I'm really, really in favor of this work. So in Vermont, there's a group of people that wanted to find other ways to respond to psychiatric crises, oftentimes psychosis, psychotic crises, and they've created a model called the collaborative network approach that's really directly informed by open dialogue that was developed in Tornio, Finland. And it was developed in Tornio, Finland based on family therapy principles, and it was a complete reorganization of their mental health system in that catchment area. So it's very important to realize that CNA is not a treatment model, it's not a thing, it's really an effort to reorganize the mental health system and how we provide care. And some of the key elements are responding quickly within the first 24 hours, being flexible and mobile in how we provide treatment. So here we do go to people's homes, 2 facilitators, and do the work in home, and people really, really, really respect and respond well to that. And a key element that we don't talk about too much is that in Tornio, their research success really seems to demonstrate that by not using neuroleptics so heavily, especially at the beginning, leads to a better long-term result. So I know that can be like an iffy thing to talk about, but I think it's super, super important. So in Vermont, there's a state-level training that some of you have taken. It's a 2-year training. I'm one of the trainers, I'm happy to say, and we have active facilitators doing CNA work in the agency. I'm the point person. If you think you have a family, a network that might want this type of service, just reach out to me, and then I kind of negotiate the ifs, ands, or buts about it. And it's really designed to be a front door response, right? But we're just not integrated into, we haven't been able to take over the medical system quite yet. I think that's sufficient, yeah?
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
I have another question in the chat. So, and I apologize if I'm mispronouncing this person's name. Islan asks or says that ASSIST is a good program, but only has 6 beds. Can we have more facilities like that in the community?
That is a great question, and I think that prioritizing these kinds of programs when we don't meet the community, when the capacity doesn't meet the community need is really important. That's a good thing for us to know, but also a good thing for our state government and legislators to know as well. That the need is broad. Thank you.
Anyone else? Any others?
I don't know if this is working, yeah. I don't know if I have a question per se, but just to offer some other alternatives. I'm Chris. I run 2 programs with Pathways Vermont. Our Vermont State Support Line, which is a statewide support line that folks can call 24/7, and then also our community center, which is here in Burlington, that also provides peer support. I think it's also good to know that we have a Soteria house here in Burlington. That's a 5-bed option, and we have another peer respite that's going to be coming soon. That's on the way. So we also have Lissum, which I'm also a co-chair of the board for that organization as well. So there's a lot of peer options that exist. I think one of the things for me in this piece, like some of the language around mental illness, I know is definitely a topic that I very much struggle with, just this assumption that someone would be mentally ill or this label being put on people. I think from my own experiences, the reason I credit not having been hospitalized, not having been institutionalized or even being on psych meds now is because I got access to peer support at a time where many people don't get access to that. So just being able to just, trying to ask for just those options to be considered and included as well. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
So this question is from Jessica from Champlain Toxicology Lab. Jessica asks, is drug testing a tool often utilized to monitor mental health medication compliance?
I'm pondering the question. So is drug testing a tool often used to monitor medication compliance?
For mental health treatment.
Mental health treatment compliance. I do not use that often. I've seen it used in some settings, particularly sometimes in substance use treatment settings. Not often in my practice.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, Simi. In the slide you showed that had the correlation in hospitalizations and prisons, it seems as though there was a period of about 10 years between 1970 and 1980 where there was a decrease markedly in both of those.
Yeah.
Was something happening in that point in our history? Was that just coincidence? Where it seemed like both prison stays were down and hospital stays were down.
Yeah, I think that what you're talking about, we saw a huge explosion in the number of people who experienced housing insecurity and homelessness at that time. Okay. But there may be other things you're thinking of, Matt. Is this something come up for you specifically?
No, it just looked like that might have been a significant period in our history. I didn't know if maybe there was like a great funding boom or there was some other thing happening at that time that was progressive.
I see. I don't know. It's a great question. I know that we experienced more housing insecurity in that time, but there may have been other relevant things going on. And I noticed that too and had a similar question.
Great. Thank you.
And I wonder if it's everybody leaving, it takes a little while to catch them in a new area, so you just have a mashup. Right. That was my guess.
Hello. So I remember when that New York Times article came out, and I really enjoyed it. At the end, the mother, I think, was the one who was kind of narrating it, and she was struck with this despair because in the end he decides to walk away from the apartment, or it looks like it's pretty clear that that's what he's going to do. And she made the point that, he's so deep in his own reality that his choices aren't really meaningful because he's not making choices based on what's going on around him. And, I see out in the community the tension between the Supreme Court case where it says, they can't live in the community safely, which is fairly broad. But in Vermont, we've really, really narrowed that.
Yeah.
My cynical self says sometimes we've done that because treatment is expensive.
Yep.
And we don't want to spend the money on people who need treatment. And I'm just wondering if you feel like there will ever be a time to try to move that so that, because like you said, it's extremely narrow.
Yeah.
To benefit a wider group of people, which I also appreciate that mandatory treatment involuntary treatment isn't always very helpful. But when a person isn't really making a meaningful choice, and you know that that's not a life that they would actually have chosen. It seems like, it just seems like it's not very client-centered. It seems like it's not very humane. It doesn't feel right. And I don't know if I just wanted you to speak on if you think there's ever any chance that that might move to expand a little bit, or is this kind of where we are as a society right now? Do you have a sense of that?
You know, I think Vermont is really different from our neighbors, and we are, in my observation, we prioritize an individual's choice over their capacity to make the choice. So we prioritize their choice regardless of whether, we see that somebody has the capacity to look at the risks and benefits meaningfully. And that was a real shock for me when I moved to Vermont about 10 years ago. And I think it has the deficits that you've described, that if someone were well or in a different state of mind, that they may make a very different decision for themselves. I don't know if we'll change from that position. I think, I'm not a lawyer, I'm a physician, but when I look at our involuntary treatment laws, they're written in a way that could be interpreted in multiple different ways, but they're applied very narrowly. So, I don't know if we'll change. I can tell you, I specifically on the issue of capacity to agree to inpatient treatment, I've really advocated for looking rigorously at capacity to make that decision. And I don't think that there's an enormous amount of sympathy for that right now. The priority has been with allowing people to make a choice even when they experience things that impair their ability to really look at the broad implications of those choices.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the question.
Anyone else?
I just have to make a comment. I can shout it from here, sorry.
No, I think, please come to the mic so everybody at home can hear
Clumsy
too.
anyway, I've got big boots on today. I don't think it's so much a question of yes hospitalization, no hospitalization, expanding the opportunities to involuntarily hospitalize people as much as it's a question as showing the efficacy of treatment, inpatient treatment. It's not working. So we can keep putting people in the hospital for a week or two at a time, and they come out, and we know that actually that's a very high rate of suicide time for people that first week exiting the hospital. So I think that has to be part of the conversation, is that there might be more support for involuntary hospitalization if the treatment worked.
Yeah, that's fair, and brief hospitalizations don't work that well. Yeah, for sure.
No, it's fine.
Another question. For the folks who aren't legislators, Howard Center employees, or just part of that network, what can be done? And maybe to narrow it down, I'm thinking of a specific instance where, it doesn't have to be this specific instance, but just to narrate it, you're walking down Church Street and someone's also walking down the street just screaming, clearly having some problem. Is the right thing to do there just do nothing and kind of take the Supreme Court approach where they're not being violent, so let them do their thing? Or is there something that can be done there or should be done?
Yeah, I think the right thing to do is the human thing to do, and ask somebody how they're doing. And keep an eye on your own safety if you think that that somebody is not welcoming that approach. But the right thing to do is the human thing to do, and ask your neighbor how they're doing and if they need something.
Thanks.
Yeah.
You can also call
Yes.
someone else too if you're not comfortable, and let us know. You can call First Call 24/7 and let them know. We have street outreach's number, community outreach's number, and you can call and say, I'm concerned about this person.
Yeah,
You know,
absolutely.
this is what I'm seeing, this is what but I don't know what to do, and we can talk to you, talk you through what might be helpful.
Yeah, I'm going to repeat that for the folks at home. Thank you, Deanna. You can no, thank you. You can also, if call First Call 24/7 to have somebody assist that person and assess the situation.
So I think we've come to the end unless there's any last questions. Thank you, Dr. Rep.
Felt super scared to step up to the mic, but finally garnered up the bravery to do so.
Thank you for asking a question. I appreciate it.
You're welcome. So, my name is Sean Zapolsky. I'm a self-advocate, and I got a page on this. I got a page on Instagram where I post not only like day in the life posts, but also advocacy related content as well. Feel free to follow me. It's _awesome, spelled AUSOME _autistic. And not entirely sure how relevant this question would be, but so there are a lot of individuals out there who are in their adult age and are also disabled, and they also, struggle to stand up for themselves, especially, when, they're living with their legal guardians and, for some reason, they're being abused, and, how, foster care is like, one of the purposes of foster care is to, maybe to, protect, children-aged people, from like a really hostile environment. And what are your thoughts on like doing the same for, what are your thoughts on like doing the same for disabled adults who aren't really, capable of, defending themselves, for some reason, that particular situation, foster care for disabled adults, and how well do you think that would pan out?
So actually, there are programs just like that. I think that's a wonderful question, and there are programs like that for adults who experience disabilities to live with families and supported by families in the community. So it's a great question, and also something that is already being done with a lot of success.
Does that program have a name?
I'd
like to do some research on it.
Is there maybe somebody else could fill me in with a broad name to describe that concept? Okay, that's what I didn't know if there was a broader name to. Okay, shared living providers. Thank you.
I actually had a shared living provider myself.
Okay.
And didn't know, they could also, do that sort of thing too. That's good to know.
Thank you.
You're welcome. You're a great speaker.
Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ravven.
Thank you.
Thanks to all of you for coming out. Thanks to our at-home audience. And our next session is here on May 2nd, substance use in our community. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.